So data storytelling starts with insight, right? You've got to help people, sort of see a better story, right? That's an unexpected shift to this better story. That's what our insight is. And let me just show then the steps then towards the story patterns. And I want to just describe to you some of those at a very high level, some of those story patterns that we play around with in the story-powered data program. You find your insight, you then go and add your stories. You think, what stories are going to bring that to life? And then, of course, you want to then choose. As you're doing that, you're choosing from this smorgasbord of possible story patterns. So let me give you a sense of what they are. The first one is probably the easiest one in many ways, is what we call a timeline story. So I tell you, if you can see a graph which has got time along the bottom, it's pretty easy to come up with a story about that. By the way, even if there is no obvious change in what's going on with your data, even the fact that there's no change could potentially be a story, okay? So timeline stories is the easiest sort of story to tell. The second one is we call an explanation story. So you might have some phenomena presented. It might be pie charts, it could be timeline stories, it could be on a map using geographic information systems. However that information presented, you want to be able to explain the phenomena, tell the story that explain how that happened, right? How that sort of representation, that result that you got in the data actually occurred. So that's an explanation story. The third one, and this is actually one of the real vital elements of storytelling, is you need to be able to zoom into a specific moment to bring it to life. A friend of mine is a data analyst for a big food company in South America, and he's doing all this work on essentially wheat volumes that were being loaded onto their ships at their port, and all of a sudden he notices that there's a big drop in wheat volumes. He's pulling his hair out, he's trying to work out what's going on. So, as he's a real top professional, he jumps in his car, he drives out to the port, and there he sees those massive chutes of wheat sort of pouring onto these massive ships, and he sees out of the 6 sort of big conveyor belts that are sort of doing this, 2 of them are out of action. All of a sudden he's got the answer to his question, right? Now you see that by going into that specific moment, you could see what I was talking about. It becomes visual for you, right? And that's actually one of the essence of great storytelling, is you can make it visual. And that happens in moments, right? Data moments. Sometimes your data is a little bit boring, right? And sometimes it's better just to be able to tell how the phenomena, how the insight was discovered, right? And so that's great. You can sort of go back a little bit and sort of say how the project started and all the starts and stops along the way to the point where you actually make the aha moment and go, wow, we've got the discovery. Next, number translations. Oh, this is one of my favourite areas at the moment. We just assume people understand the numbers that we're sharing with our audiences, but the reality is, we've had what we say, probably around 50 to 70,000 years of human evolution, and during the vast majority of that time, we really only needed to count up to 5, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Anything bigger than that, we just said lots. And if you look at oral languages, this is how it is. It's their number counting system. And then all of a sudden, in the last, 10,000 years, we're sort of not even that, 5,000 years, we've been adding this concept of numbers. People don't really understand. It's a second language. So we've got to translate those. We've got to say things like, say, for example, you have 300,000 gamers exit from the game in some remarkable way. That's a big number, but how do you feel that number? We can sort of say, imagine, you're walking into the biggest stadium in the world, and within 6 hours, everyone just pours out of that stadium. Right? So all of a sudden, you've now got a bit of a feeling for the number and the size and whatnot. Or it might be a town. It might be the population of Canberra. All of a sudden, they've just disappeared within a day. Now you're starting to get a feel for it. That's number translation. There's lots of different ways to translate numbers. Now, sometimes to get people to understand your data, you need to do something remarkable. You need to do something that will trigger a story, right? So this is the next sort of data pattern. It's an unusual one because it's not so much about the story you tell, but the action you take. So, for example, with one of the companies we worked with, they had lots and lots of products, and their product people were just trying to make the argument to their senior decision makers that they had too many products. They couldn't get them to really listen. So what they did, they hired out a basketball court, they put every product across that basketball court, and then dragged in the leaders to have a look. And as soon as they saw it, they just shook their head and this is way too much, right? So this is how we trigger a story. They've now got a new story in their head. Last couple, nice one is the data sandwich. The data sandwich is when you tell a nice little story and you just fill it with data, right? Because data on its own is so dry and boring. You know, you've got to give it some heft, some fibre, and that's what the data sandwich will actually do for you. So we will talk about that. And then the last one is just the comparative story. You can sort of say, okay, well, here's the story that's happening in our data, but sometimes it's very hard to understand what that means until you see a comparison story, right? So just getting people to look for that comparison story. So that's the sort of the main ones. The last one, of course, is the analogy. Forgot that one, but that's the analogy story. An analogy story is when one of the ones that just sprung to mind there is Steve Jobs, right? He came up with a phrase that really got a lot of, I guess, use through all the marketing efforts of Apple. But the story he tells is this, right? He sort of says he's reading through Scientific America and he comes across a table of speeds of animals. And right at the top is the condor. That's the fastest animal on Earth, right? And then way, way, way down the bottom of the table is the human. Anyway, some clever scientist also added to this with a follow-up article that if you put a human on a bicycle, well, all of a sudden the human gets right up, not to the top, but close to the top of that list. And then Steve Jobs says, but a computer is really a bicycle for the mind. Right? See what he did there? That just takes that analogy, tells that little story. To me, that's a classic analogy story, right? So I don't think that's the full list, by the way. I think there's many others. But these are the ones we'll play with in story-powered data.